The shimmering dress was the most dangerous thing Marilyn Monroe wore, hiding a fragile note that forced the world's most powerful man to confront a buried truth. She delivered a moral ultimatum that risked her career, shocking President Kennedy and quietly going viral. The famous shimmering dress hung on the back of the door, blinding even in the dim backstage light, but Marilyn Monroe saw no glamour, only the heavy, oppressive weight of an obligation she was terrified to fulfill. She wasn't preparing for a performance, she was preparing for a public sacrifice, a ritual that confirmed her role as the world's most beautiful and most disposable asset. The White House invitation felt less like an honor and more like the final golden shackle tightening around the fragile woman inside the icon. That night in May, the air in her dressing room at Madison Square Garden was thick with ozone and anxiety. Marilyn paced the worn carpet, twisting a simple gold ring on her finger, the only thing of Norma Jeane she allowed herself to keep close. The public saw the breathy voice and the intoxicating smile, but what they missed was the profound, crippling fear that always preceded her greatest triumphs. She knew what this performance was truly about. It was paying the ultimate debt of fame. She owed Hollywood for the lights, the studios for the name, and now she owed the most powerful family in the world for the access. It was a currency she was forced to spend again and again. Her dazzling presence, her intoxicating vulnerability, the way she could hold a room with a single whispered word. She was utterly exhausted by the demands of the persona. Every smile, every sachet, every vulnerable glance felt like a betrayal of the private woman who longed for nothing more than a quiet life and a sense of being truly, unconditionally loved. But love was not an option. Only dazzling admiration was offered, and that came with a price tag written in political favors and endless scrutinizing demands. The world was waiting for her to step out in that dress, a gown so famously sheer it had been sewn onto her body, and deliver a gift of unforgettable fantasy to a room full of powerful men who viewed her as a magnificent, exquisite toy. The fabric felt tight, almost suffocating, digging into her ribs as if it were physically reminding her of the constraints of her fame. She knew with chilling clarity that the moment she stopped shining, the moment she stopped being useful, they would simply toss her aside. She looked into the mirror, not at the reflection, but through it, seeing the girl who had once dreamed of being a real actress, of being seen for her depth, not just her figure. That girl had been buried beneath layers of platinum hair and 1,000-watt smiles. Tonight, she had to play the role one last time, the ultimate ingenue for the ultimate audience. But there was a growing, desperate ache in her soul, the desire to use her power just once for something. That mattered. Something real, something that honored the pain of the unseen people she felt she represented. As the frantic 10-minute call came over the intercom, Marilyn finally reached for the dress. It was a stunning, glittering cage, but inside, Norma Jeane was desperately searching for a moment of quiet rebellion. She needed a reason to risk it all. She needed a sign that her voice, and not just her appearance, could move mountains. It was in that fragile, anxious moment just before the curtain rose on the most sensational night of her career that the first unexpected piece of paper slipped into her hand, a tiny, folded whisper of desperation from the cold world outside her star-studded bubble. The moment Marilyn Monroe stepped into the blazing white light, a collective sound rippled through the 15,000 people gathered, a gasp that felt like a physical wave of adoration, yet also a powerful current that threatened to pull her under. She was a beacon of impossible glamour, yet beneath the shimmering surface of the gown, her heart was thrumming not with confidence, but with the quiet terror of a woman walking a tightrope high above an expectant, unforgiving crowd. All the while, she tightly shielded a small, ordinary piece of folded paper hidden in the warmth of her hand. Her performance was the stuff of legend, a breathy, vulnerable, almost impossibly intimate serenade that seemed to hypnotize the entire arena. But as the performance ended and the applause became deafening, Marilyn felt only a profound exhaustion. The real, cold, political work was about to begin. She was ushered immediately to a private reception at the White House, the transition from the theatrical warmth of the stage to the chilly formality of power being jarring and immediate. The room was not filled with fans, but with cold, calculating political eyes that assessed her as an asset, not an artist. President Kennedy, the object of the serenade, was handsome and charming, yet his distance was palpable, a reminder that this spectacle was purely transactional. She stood near a marble pillar, sipping flat champagne, feeling utterly alone despite the crush of people. She was surrounded by the most powerful people in America, yet she felt invisible, like a shimmering object on display. It was in this moment of deep isolation that she noticed a woman, not a celebrity or a senator, but a young, plainly dressed White House administrative assistant, standing nervously at the edge of the room. The assistant's eyes, Marilyn noticed, were not appraising her. They were pleading with her. They held a raw, heartbreaking desperation that cut through the superficiality of the entire party. As Marilyn was being steered toward a powerful diplomat, the administrative assistant subtly intercepted her path. The encounter was a blink, a flash of terror in Eleanor's eyes. The young woman's hand brushed Marilyn's, and something small, rectangular, and folded was pressed firmly into the icon's palm. It was a moment of instinct. Marilyn's fingers closed around the paper before her mind registered the act. The assistant did not speak. She did not even meet Marilyn's eyes. She simply offered a look of profound silent misery before melting back into the crowd of anonymous staffers. Marilyn's entire body went cold. It was the note, a new one, replacing the simple reminder she had used to calm herself earlier. This was a desperate message from the outside world, a fragile plea tossed into the gilded cage of celebrity. She gripped it so tightly the paper crinkled. It was a terrifying responsibility, a whisper of real-world pain penetrating the fortress of her fame. She knew instantly that whatever was written inside, it was a request that could not be easily ignored. The weight of that tiny slip of paper felt heavier than the weight of her entire celebrity. She excused herself from the diplomat with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes, realizing she had just been given an impossible mission. She now held the fate of an ordinary, suffering person in her delicate, trembling hand, and she desperately needed a moment of privacy to understand the magnitude of the appeal. She retreated to the nearest private space, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the fear in her throat. The piece of paper felt thin and fragile, yet dangerous. Whatever request was contained within its folds was about to challenge the carefully constructed walls of her life, and perhaps the conscience of the powerful men who controlled it. The White House powder room was a quiet, ornate fortress, a momentary refuge from the deafening clamor of celebrity and political power. But when Marilyn Monroe unfolded the clandestine note, the silence became heavier than any roar. Written quickly in a neat feminine script, the 12 words that mattered were not a request for an autograph or a favor, but a raw, agonizing appeal. My sister is gone. Please ask him to look. I have nowhere left to turn. Marilyn felt a sudden, profound rush of icy clarity. The note was signed simply, Eleanor. She instantly recognized the heartbreak behind the words, the same soul-deep agony of feeling utterly unseen and discarded that she, Norma Jeane, had known her whole life. She was the most famous woman in the world, yet here was a powerful, hidden reality. A young administrative assistant named Eleanor, who worked within these very walls of power, was unable to secure even the basic human decency of an inquiry into her sister's disappearance. The note contained a few more desperate lines. Eleanor's younger sister, Sarah, had been a dedicated activist working in a remote southern state. Weeks ago, she had vanished without a trace. Local authorities were quick to dismiss the case, labeling it an unavoidable running away or a simple accident, closing ranks against any serious investigation. Eleanor was certain the case was being actively suppressed for political convenience, Sarah's work being deemed inconvenient to powerful local interests. Eleanor had tried every channel, police, politicians, press, but the system was built to protect itself, not the vulnerable. She had risked her entire career, perhaps her freedom, on the desperate, improbable hope that the world's most famous blonde might possess the one thing Eleanor lacked, a voice so bright it could cut through the darkness of political indifference. This was the dangerous request. Marilyn, who was here purely to be admired and then dismissed, was being asked to stop performing and start fighting. She was asked to leverage her terrifying, spectacular power, not for a contract or a role, but for a forgotten life. This was not a plea for money or fame. It was a plea for moral attention, a demand for the President of the United States to spend 5 minutes of his energy on a problem that was politically inconvenient. Marilyn knew that feeling of being a woman whose truth was inconvenient and easily suppressed, and felt a fierce, immediate loyalty to Sarah. Marilyn knew the risk was catastrophic. Her career was a fragile ecosystem balanced on the goodwill of powerful men. To challenge Kennedy on a sensitive political matter, to demand accountability for a missing activist, was to choose her conscience over her career. It was to invite the kind of permanent, destructive scorn that could erase her entirely. But as she stood there, clutching the note in her hand, the faces of the unseen, the lonely, the exploited that she carried within her heart, they demanded she act. She carefully folded the note and tucked it deep inside her shimmering gown. The decision was made. She would not leave the White House that night until she had stood up for Eleanor and for Sarah, no matter the consequence. She looked at her reflection. The golden idol was still there, but her eyes held a new, steely resolve. Marilyn emerged from the powder room, the iconic smile perfectly fixed, but the terror was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. She had a new mission, one far more important than any movie. She now had to find a way to stop the party, to stop the politics, and demand a moment alone with the most powerful man in the free world to force him to confront the simple fact of human suffering. Marilyn Monroe moved through the White House reception like a shimmering ghost, her famed charisma suddenly focused with surgical precision, until she managed to secure a few stolen minutes with the president under the urgent pretense of a confidential film proposal. This was the Oval Office, the seat of untold power, and as the heavy door closed, Marilyn felt the weight of history and the weight of Eleanor's desperate plea pressed down on her shoulders. The conversation began exactly as protocol demanded. Marilyn played the role of the glamorous, slightly scatterbrained star, discussing film projects and offering charming, breathy compliments. For 5 minutes, she was the beautiful illusion the world expected. President Kennedy, enjoying the display, leaned back in his chair, charmed and relaxed. The atmosphere was light, superficial, and entirely predictable, but Marilyn's heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against the dangerous piece of paper hidden near her chest. She knew she had mere seconds before the spell broke, before his next engagement pulled him away. Then, with a sudden, devastating clarity, Marilyn stopped performing. The breathless quality left her voice, and the artificial light in her eyes was replaced by a look of profound, challenging seriousness. She moved closer to the desk, her famous figure utterly forgotten as she focused on the simple moral truth of her mission. She reached into her gown and pulled out the folded note, laying it quietly, almost reverently, on the president's mahogany desk next to a stack of official documents. "Mr. President," she said, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone that was entirely unfamiliar to him, "I did not come here tonight to talk about a movie. I came here about the words on this piece of paper." Kennedy's expression shifted instantly from amusement to irritation. He picked up the note with a fastidious, almost cold detachment, read the few words, and then set it down with a firm, dismissive motion. He gave it a flick of his wrist, the minimal, powerful gesture showing utter contempt for the urgency of her request. "Mrs. Monroe, this is a beautiful gesture of empathy, but the Oval Office is not the place for local police matters, and certainly not for anonymous notes from my staff." His tone was polite, but laced with political impatience. "It is not your concern, and it is not my concern." His immediate, dismissive rejection, the cold political dismissal of human suffering, stung Marilyn deeply, validating her fear that power prioritized expediency over decency. She saw the familiar wall of dismissal that shielded the powerful from the plight of the forgotten. She realized he did not see a tragedy. He saw an inconvenience. Marilyn felt the intense internal conflict raging. The urge to retreat, to be the obedient star, battled against the fierce loyalty she felt toward Eleanor, toward Sarah, and toward the vulnerable Norma Jeane she still was. The president smiled faintly, already standing, signaling the end of the meeting, but Marilyn remained rooted to the spot, refusing to move. She knew this was the moment when she had to risk everything, because if she walked away now, she would forever feel regret. President Kennedy reached for the Oval Office door handle, signaling with absolute certainty that the discussion was over, but Marilyn Monroe, the world's most famous blonde, simply moved to stand in his path, transforming the room from a political chamber into a stage for the real performance of her life. The mask of the breathy, playful star fell completely away, replaced by the blazing intensity of Norma Jeane, and the effect was electric and profoundly unsettling. "Mr. President, you can end the meeting," she stated, her voice steady and clear, devoid of any Hollywood affectation. But you cannot end the fact that there is a young woman, a family whose heart is being torn out in these halls because her sister, an activist, has been erased. The same indifference that says a local case is not your concern is the same indifference that allows powerful people to use others and then discard them. Marilyn's intensity was shocking. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was issuing a moral challenge. She drew a parallel between the activist's invisibility and her own profound feeling of being disposable, of being valued only for her brief, shimmering fantasy. You see me as a moment of beautiful escape, a dazzling toy to be admired and then put back in the box, she continued, her voice trembling now with genuine emotion. But out there are thousands of unseen women, people who matter, who are simply fighting for the right to exist, the right to be remembered. That young woman in your staff, Eleanor, trusted me with her desperation because she felt she had nowhere else to turn. If I, with all this fame, can be easily forgotten and cast aside when I'm inconvenient, imagine what happens to a missing activist with no famous friends. Kennedy was stunned. This was not the Marilyn he knew, the one who offered fragile compliance. This was an enraged prophet, a fierce defender of the vulnerable, and her words carried the weight of universal pain. He tried to interrupt, but she pressed on, her eyes welling with unshed tears that were not for herself, but for Sarah and Eleanor. In her mind, a cold voice whispered, "This is it. They will destroy me now for this." She finally stated the dangerous request clearly and unequivocally. "I am not asking you to solve the case today. I am asking you to publicly acknowledge her disappearance and privately order a legitimate, unbiased federal investigation. Do not let her be forgotten simply because she is inconvenient. Prove to Eleanor, prove to the people who work for you, that the power of this office is there to protect the unseen, not just the powerful." The air was thick with the residue of her moral bomb. Kennedy stared at her, his expression a complicated mix of shock, fury, and briefly an uncomfortable flicker of something that looked like guilt. He realized that this delicate star had just committed a career ruin to call out his conscience. The silence that followed was agonizing, broken only by the distant sounds of the continuing party. Kennedy stepped away from the door, his hands clenched, his face hardening as he processed the monumental defiance he had just witnessed. He now knew he was facing not a request, but an ultimatum, and he was about to deliver a chilling response that would make Marilyn understand the true meaning of political jeopardy. The moment was suspended in a horrifying silence, the tension in the Oval Office so thick it was nearly visible, as President Kennedy's carefully constructed charm disintegrated, replaced by the chilling, ruthless calculation of raw political power. The air turned instantly cold, shifting from a tense conversation to the imminent delivery of an ultimatum, proving to Marilyn Monroe the catastrophic cost of challenging the people who pull the strings. Kennedy slowly walked back to his desk, his jaw set, and leaned forward, his voice a low, hard whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "Mrs. Monroe, you are a treasure," he began, every word dripping with cold irony, "and you are useful to this country when you remember your role. Your role is beauty, entertainment, and distraction. It is not morality. It is not politics." He leveled a stare at her that cut through the illusion of her fame. "This city is built on secrets, and you, more than anyone, have a history that requires discretion. You have powerful enemies in Hollywood, in the studios, and frankly, in Washington, who would love nothing more than a reason to paint you as unstable, unreliable, or worse." He detailed the tools they would use. Studio bosses being fed anonymous quotes about her difficult behavior, rival journalists receiving tips about her emotional breakdown. He did not need to finish the threat. Marilyn understood instantly the political jeopardy she had created. He was threatening to unleash the full force of the political media machine on her reputation, to exhume every past mistake, every moment of personal fragility, and twist it until her career, her very sanity, was destroyed. It was a thinly veiled promise of professional ruin if she did not immediately comply. The silence was the sound of her world collapsing. Marilyn felt a surge of nausea and terror, the fear so intense it made her knees tremble. Yet she forced herself to stand absolutely still. The man who had received her breathy serenade was now offering to harm her, all because she dared to ask for justice for an activist whose life was considered expendable. It was in that frightening moment that she found a reserve of quiet dignity, the fierce, dry resolution she needed to choose her moral compass over her survival. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. She had already chosen. She reached out and quietly slid Eleanor's folded note back toward the president, placing it precisely where he had originally dismissed it. She did not argue or plead. "I understand the risk, Mr. President," she said, her voice now barely audible but vibrating with courage. "I know the price, but my answer is already on the paper. I won't betray the one person who risked everything to reach out to me. You decide if the silence of this office is worth more than a life." She turned without waiting for a reply, the shimmering dress suddenly feeling like the heaviest, most humiliating burden she had ever worn. She walked away from the most powerful man in the world, having rejected his protection and embraced an uncertain, terrifying fate. Marilyn fled the Oval Office, leaving behind the chilling reality of the powerful machine she had just opposed. She had delivered her request and accepted the inevitable ultimatum. Now she had only to face the desperate, worried eyes of the young woman who had placed her faith in the kindness of the world's most vulnerable icon. Marilyn Monroe emerged from the private wing of the White House, her famous smile utterly extinguished, feeling the invisible pressure of 1,000 political eyes now watching her, judging her, waiting for the signal to strike. She had survived the ultimatum, but the victory felt hollow, replaced by the profound, paralyzing fear of having just signed the warrant for her own political and professional isolation. But as she hurried toward the waiting car, a single small figure stepped out from the shadows near the columned portico. It was Eleanor, the administrative assistant, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with frantic, great guilt. Eleanor had risked her job, her future, and perhaps her safety by waiting. She instantly recognized the shattered look on Marilyn's face. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Monroe," Eleanor whispered, clutching her hands together. "He dismissed you, did not he? He threatened you. I caused you to sacrifice everything, and it was for nothing. I should never have asked." Eleanor was sobbing now, consumed by guilt, convinced that she had merely added another tragedy to the already painful existence of her idol. She saw Marilyn not as a star, but as a kind woman she had forced into a losing battle. But Marilyn, though trembling from her confrontation with Kennedy, found a surprising calm. The emotional performance was over. Now she was entirely Norma Jeane, stripped bare of vanity and focused only on the person in front of her. She gently took Eleanor's hands, her touch warm and surprisingly steady. Her hands, which had just performed for thousands, were now steadying one terrified woman. "Stop," Marilyn said, her voice soft but firm. "It was not for nothing, and you did not cause me to do anything. I chose this." She looked past the shame in Eleanor's eyes into the deep, fierce love Eleanor held for her missing sister, Sarah. "Sometimes, Eleanor, the most important victory is simply refusing to be silenced. I risked nothing compared to the risk you took to get that note to me and the risk your sister took to stand up for her beliefs." Marilyn's empathy was a powerful balm. She reminded Eleanor that they were kindred spirits, both women who had been treated unfairly by powerful men, yet both possessed a quiet internal strength that defied the roles assigned to them. "He heard the request, Eleanor," Marilyn concluded, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "I made him look at the paper. I made him choose. Now we wait. We wait with dignity, and we do not apologize for demanding decency." She knew the backlash would be swift, ruthless, and designed to discredit her entirely. She was going home to await the inevitable leaks. The whispers about her instability, the canceled contracts, the subtle, chilling evidence that the powerful had moved to erase her. But standing there with Eleanor, sharing a secret handshake of mutual defiance, Marilyn felt a quiet dignity she had never known, one that outshone every diamond she had ever worn. Marilyn finally stepped into her car, leaving Eleanor standing resolute beneath the cold, indifferent gaze of the White House. The dangerous part of her mission was done, but the quiet, terrifying consequences were just beginning. She had stood up to the president, and now she knew she had only one weapon left. She had to use her incredible, dazzling fame, not to entertain, but to start a public conversation that the men in power desperately wanted to keep hidden. The silence from the White House was more terrifying than any loud accusation. Yet within 24 hours, the subtle, harmful whispers began, spreading through Hollywood and Washington like an insidious fog. It was the backlash disguised as concern. Canceled appearances, anonymous studio sources lamenting Marilyn's unreliability, and veiled articles suggesting her famous emotional fragility was once again causing problems for her management. The machine was moving to erase her, but Marilyn refused to fight their ugly rumors. Instead, she chose to use her fading spotlight for one final devastating act of moral honesty. A few days later, Marilyn attended a press event that had been scheduled weeks in advance to announce a generic film project. Her handlers were tense, ready for her to offer the usual breathy soundbites and deflect the growing storm of gossip. But as she stepped up to the microphone, her platinum hair shining under the camera lights, Marilyn gave the performance of a lifetime. A quiet, heartfelt delivery that was entirely unscripted and emotionally devastating. She began by discussing the joy of storytelling, the magic of film. Then she paused, and her eyes, filled with unshed tears, scanned the room. "But the greatest stories," she said, her voice soft but amplified perfectly across the room, "are often the ones we don't see, the ones of quiet courage." She ignored the frantic gestures of her publicist off camera. We live in a world obsessed with glamour, with the things that shine the brightest. And it is so easy to forget that the true beauty, the real substance, is held by the people who are unseen, the people who are struggling and standing up for what is right, even when the world ignores them. She continued, weaving a delicate, unmistakable thread directly to the missing activist, Sarah. We forget the value of those whose voices are silenced, or who are discarded simply because they are inconvenient. I have always believed that our purpose, mine, yours, everyone's, is to ensure that no person feels forgotten, that no struggle for human decency is waged in isolation. She spoke about the need for compassion and the profound importance of seeing one another, a clear echo of the plea written on the note. It was not a political statement, but a profoundly emotional one. It was Norma Jeane speaking to the vulnerable people across America who had never felt invisible. The reporters in the front row lowered their pens, realizing they were not hearing gossip, but a painful, honest truth about vulnerability. The reporters, expecting drama, were instead hit with a wave of unexpected sincerity. The next morning, her words, not the film announcement, but the passionate, veiled plea, went viral in the 1960s sense. Her message was replayed on news broadcasts, discussed on morning radio, and printed on every front page. It sparked a wave of public inquiry, letters, and calls, all demanding to know what forgotten story had moved the world's most famous woman to such open, raw vulnerability. The political cover-up could no longer rely on silence and dismissal. Marilyn's act of courage had done what Eleanor's desperation could not. It had forced the case out of the darkness and into the unforgiving light of public opinion. Marilyn left the press conference feeling a sense of profound, exhausted relief. She had fired her shot, using her fame as a shield for the voiceless, and now the public was asking the questions the White House had sought to avoid. All that was left was to see if her moral stand had been enough to penetrate the cold defenses of the most powerful man in the nation. A week after Marilyn Monroe's heartfelt televised plea, the Oval Office was not quiet. It was simmering with intense political fury, focused entirely on the small, folded note that still lay beside President Kennedy's blotter. His staff were apoplectic, demanding he publicly discredit Marilyn, but the powerful force of her sincere appeal and the resulting massive volume of letters and calls from the American people had pinned the president in a moral corner. He sat behind the desk, his hands clasped, listening to his political advisors rage about the unacceptable emotionalism and the uncontrolled star. They were furious that a celebrity had managed to bypass the entire political apparatus and go directly to the hearts of the American public, forcing a conversation about an inconvenient truth. But Kennedy, gazing at the piece of paper containing Eleanor's plea, was no longer listening to their calculations. He was hearing Marilyn's clear, challenging voice and seeing the profound conviction in her eyes that night. He had expected her to retreat, to be easily silenced by the threat of political trouble, but instead, she had used her most valuable asset, her fame, to defend the voiceless. The true drama of that week was not played out on the news, but in the internal struggle of the president, who was forced to confront his own conscience. He was a man accustomed to making hard, cold, calculated choices, but Marilyn's unexpected moral courage had injected a raw human element into the heart of his political machine. He remembered her words, "Prove to Eleanor that the power of this office is there to protect the unseen, not just the powerful." It was a challenge that went deeper than policy or ratings. It questioned his character, his legacy. He realized that discrediting Marilyn would make him look petty and callous, only confirming her accusation that the powerful harm the vulnerable. He could not politically afford to appear less human than the world's most idealized blonde. In a stunning moment of quiet concession, he dismissed his staff. Alone, he stood, walking over to the window that looked out onto the sprawling White House grounds, making a decision that defied every piece of advice his political team had given him. He stared at the small, fragile note on his desk, realizing the simple paper was more powerful than all the surrounding political counsel combined. He picked up the telephone and made 3 calls, not to the press, not to his political allies, but to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. The orders were quiet, low profile, and utterly clear. Open and unbiased federal inquiry into the disappearance of the activist Sarah. He did not announce the decision. He did not seek credit. It was the quiet concession of a powerful man who had been defeated, not by force or politics, but by the relentless moral strength of a woman who dared to stand up for decency. The activist's family would not know the order came from the president, and the public would not see the move, but the process had begun. Marilyn Monroe had won. The president sat back down, the weight of his decision heavy but strangely light, leaving the folded note on his desk as a silent reminder of the price of true integrity. Marilyn would never receive a call, never see a thank you note, but the machinery of justice had been quietly set in motion. Now all that remained was for Eleanor to discover the profound, untold sacrifice that the fragile star had made for her family. The silence that followed was the quiet aftermath of a moral earthquake. Marilyn Monroe never heard from the president again, never received a call of thanks or apology, and the public never knew the true story behind her veiled plea. But in a small, cramped White House office, Eleanor received a single, discreet phone call from the Department of Justice, a call that informed her, simply and officially, that the federal investigation into her sister Sarah's disappearance had been opened. Eleanor understood instantly. She knew where the order had come from, and more importantly, why. She knew the price Marilyn had paid, the cancellation of contracts, the renewed vicious whispers about her personal life, was the direct result of her courage. Days later, when the investigation began to yield results, bringing closure and a chance at justice to the family, Eleanor wept, not with relief, but with a profound, overwhelming gratitude for a woman she barely knew. Eleanor did not dare call Marilyn. Instead, she penned a simple letter, sending it discreetly through a trusted personal channel, a letter that would become the unspoken thank you, the only record of Marilyn's selfless victory. Eleanor wrote, "Mrs. Monroe, I can only imagine the pressure you faced, but because of your courage, because you chose to speak for the forgotten, my sister's story will not be lost. You saved my family, and you made the most powerful man in the world remember his humanity. I pray that someone, someday, will use their voice to protect you the way you protected us." Marilyn read the letter alone, and it became one of her most private, cherished possessions. It validated the painful sacrifice she had made. It confirmed that her fame, for one shining difficult moment, had served a greater purpose than entertainment. That single act of defiance had cost her dearly in the political arena, increasing her isolation from the very powerful men she had tried to influence. But it had granted her an internal peace that no movie role or magazine cover could ever provide. This is the true legacy of Marilyn Monroe. She was not merely a star, but a quiet, fierce champion for the vulnerable, for the ones who felt discarded and unseen, like the Norma Jeane she carried within. The world demanded that she be a beautiful fantasy, but in her heart, she yearned to be a source of genuine, unconditional compassion. She paid the ultimate price for her refusal to play the cynical game, her own increasing solitude, but she was never alone, knowing that she had used her terrifying, beautiful power to cause one powerful man do the decent thing and to save a family from being lost to indifference. We live in a world obsessed with celebrity scandals and sensational headlines. often forgetting that true success is not measured in followers or box office receipts. True success, as Marilyn proved that night, is about leveraging your power, however fragile, to restore dignity to those who have none. She came to the White House as a legend, but she left as a moral hero, a woman who taught the president that the most dangerous request is simply to ask for the truth. Marilyn Monroe, the icon of glamour, was ultimately the champion of the unseen, reminding us that every person fighting an impossible battle matters. Her single act of quiet defiance proved that the greatest power in the world is not political. It is the courage to stand up for one's soul when the entire system wants to see them fall. If this story of Marilyn's quiet courage touched your heart and reminded you that the greatest power is found in protecting the unseen, hit that like button and subscribe now. Join us next time as we uncover more untold human moments behind the legends of Hollywood.